Professor Tootle and Alex Cranberg, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. So let's start at the very beginning without even any introductions. We're talking about government, and government started, Mr. History Professor, government started by a lady in a lake. And someone either went into the lake or there was a stone and they pulled the sword out and declared by God, and I don't mean to be flippant, but that's how government started, right?
Well, to quote Monty Python, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.
Okay, so
You
that
can't
doesn't
expect to wield
describe.
supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
Yeah, good. Almost exactly from memory. Bravo. But that's not the United States. How did the how well, go back even further? I don't know if you want to go caveman days. And then Alex, you'll get a reflection on his comment. But this is a history show. So from caveman days to monarchies or to some power thug, how did government start? What in 1 minute or less? Tell us about government.
1 minute or less. Almost all human relationships were based on safety and security because the world was such an unsafe place. And you needed to be a part of security arrangements in order to, lessen the chance that you were going to die. And that was the basis. And so the sort of basic security arrangement that you're born into is family, then extended family, then clans, then tribes, then nations. And all of that is how human history was sort of rocking until the United States was founded as the world's first ideological nation state on the premise that human beings can live at peace with one another. And that is why we are the Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order for the ages.
New order, okay, new order for the ages. So that was world history in
You
one
said
minute or
1 minute.
less. You have an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in history with an emphasis on U.S. and Russian relations and a couple other things. And you just did it all in 1 minute, so we never need to go to school again. Terrific. Alex, do you have a retort or a reflection or your own opinion on history of government?
I guess it's just more of a question why you think that the United States is so unique in regard to uh, world history before or after wanting to people to live together in peace. The U.S. Has not always been a force for peace. We've been pretty warlike. We have our interests. We defend them. Um, what I'm not quite sure I understand
Cool.
What makes us
the
what
uniqueness that you
at the time
described.
of the found so I guess the thing that was that the human experience was trying to grapple with was the 150 years of history from the time of the founding of the colonies up until the American Revolution. We had this very unique relationship with Britain in that we had a peaceful relationship with Britain that was not governed, and we didn't really know what to make of it. Adam Smith publishes Wealth of Nations in 1776. And even after its publication, it's not like the world just said, oh, Adam Smith is right about everything. But what we had for the first time was a demonstration that peaceful relationships could in fact be incentivized and that wealth creation was possible. But I mean, I would say it took another 200 years for people to fully appreciate it and understand that what that happened during the founding was true. That you could have a government based on the idea not that human beings were angels, but that human beings were good enough to govern themselves, and it made it possible for wealth creation to take place, and it led to essentially no wealth creation for all of human history up until the the United States and Great Britain begin actually engaging in peaceful trade with one another. War and conquest, you can make a certain group of people wealthy. So if all you're trying to do is preserve wealth for a certain class of people, You can do that through war, you can do that through conquest, but usually you're losing some wealth as a part of the war, and usually you are you're not actually creating wealth, you're just moving it from place to place. What you're talking about when we talk about wealth of nations, the idea that human beings could be prosperous and free and live peaceful lives, that is new. And if you go on, our researchers here, he can go on like our world in data and look at global wealth creation or global GDP since the year one. You can see there's a pretty big curve that happens that begins with this relationship between Britain and its colonies, and then of course just skyrockets once the United States exists as an example for the rest of the world.
All right, so I have a bazillion questions, but
But
Alex, you're the
let me,
star of the
if I
show,
could
so
just,
follow
yeah,
up.
yeah, I'll just reflect a little bit on that. I mean, certainly I understand better the point you're making now, and I largely agree with it. I would just suggest this: it's a little less about government, maybe, and more about governance. And the government is not necessarily who we're relying upon for governance. That what happened with Adam Smith in 1776 was the idea that the hidden hand would replace the right hand of the Lord, of the master, of the king, and the whip hand of the is now became we could rely on the invisible hand, and obviously dramatic increases in wealth with the in the 19th and 20th 21st centuries. Um, but there was um, I suppose that's really not just about the United States, as you point out. It's also Britain and a lot of other places, but led by the U.S. and Britain. That it's about markets. Markets are what created the governance behind trade, and up until that point in time, you really had to have a concession from the king or the lord or something who controlled top down, and now went from top down to bottom up. Less about, I would have thought, um, less about government doing more than just reflecting an acknowledgement of the importance and power of markets.
Oh, you two are doing an amazing job at letting the facilitator just listen. So, Professor Took.
Yeah, I think that I don't necessarily disagree with it, but I always want to go. I feel like we're in one way we're sort of like we've hopscotched each other's points a
Yeah,
little bit. Because I just to complete a point I think you were trying to make is that culture is what ultimately allows for the success of these things. But I would also say that culture is the thing that makes the markets possible. And I do think it's an important point to understand that um, as Lincoln did, that it's not just the piece of paper. You can't just simply have laws. It's the structure that will allow a culture to thrive. But you can't government can't create a culture. It can only destroy a culture. The actual cultural creation has to come from the people themselves. And what ultimately we call markets that are developing, the ones that were hardest to understand because they were most different from the way human beings had understood wealth creation, were the ones that weren't created because people were trying to make money. It was they were a result of the religious beliefs of people who settled in the sort of northern part of what becomes the United States. The Puritans ended up creating the cultural preconditions for free markets to function, but they weren't doing it to make money. They were doing it to follow their religious beliefs, and it just happened to create this example of that it was actually possible if you have the right cultural beliefs that you can have wealth creation. But it wasn't because we were better than any other human beings. Some of it is just a quirk of this particular religious group with the neglect of the British government, uh, but just enough protection from um, uh, external invaders, that allow for this 150 years of practicing and evolving the culture of self-government.
So, how do you account for um, the Chinese being able to go so rapidly from, you know, all fully planned communist uh, economy to one day Deng Xiaoping says, "Well, I don't care what color the cat is, I just care that it catches mice," and all of a sudden they're like becoming experts at understanding and participating in markets.
Boy, you've jumped to one of my conclusions, but let's go
Yeah,
down
no,
this
it's
path
it's a
a little
great
bit.
question, and it's an essential question, and it's the one that is vexing. And I always say this is the bad. When I talk about it in class, I say, now here's the bad news: is that terror can often work like a spotlight. You can have a very small group of people who want to maintain power and use terror and fear and shine it on any group they want. Um, and that markets will still function if you allow them to thrive. The bad news is that and is that Hitler was able to get his economy growing too. Um, Being a good society with good values is not necessarily a precondition for allowing market forces to function. They just have to have enough stability and certainty that people who are engaged in work have predictability in outcomes, meaning they're not afraid to invest in the future because they can be relatively sure that that spotlight of terror is not going to shine on them. And if the person with the monopoly on violence and terror um, gives them that assurance, um, it's usually enough that people engaged in work and investment will take that risk. Um, and so the culture of dignity and individual liberty is not something that always, at least not yet, has always naturally followed allowing for free markets to develop. It was a guess, that Nixon made. And who knows, maybe next year the Chinese Communist government will collapse. But and if it does, people will say, well, Nixon was right to make this bet that freedom will follow markets. But thus far, it has not proven to be the case.
Follow up, Alex?
I agree
Okay,
with that. Go ahead.
let me jump back in then. Uh,
Yeah.
to both of you, is the United States a just nation? Alex?
Um, it's just a nation.
That is a nice pun, but give me a better answer.
Uh,
Or I
well,
can
I
put
think,
this for the right answer.
yeah, obviously it depends upon your framework for the meaning of justice. There are
Okay.
those who count justice in a way that I wouldn't, where justice is based on equality of outcomes. And those people would say that the United States is not a just nation. If if you count justice on the basis of earning of predictability, um, then I'd say it's largely a just nation, but not completely. No nation is going to be perfect. And then if justice is based on a different cultural framework, um, based on traditional ideas of merit, for example, leading to outcomes that are seem reasonable for the amount of work put in. Yeah, I think that and you get a reward that's commensurate with the inputs of either capital or labor. I think the United States is one of the most just nations in the country, in the world, and but there's a battle over what that means, really.
Excellent. And by the way, I think most citizens should really think through this question and their answer. So thank you for yours. Professor Tootle, what is your not response, because let's just leave that alone for now. Is the United States a just nation, Professor?
The United States is founded on principles that honestly reflect human nature, and that have and it has demonstrated that in fact human beings are not angels, but human beings are good enough to govern themselves, and um, this is it means that it's not just a nation. We are, in fact, exceptional because we have served as an example for the rest of the world that human beings can govern themselves. And
Could you
the
just
fact,
answer what the definition of American exceptionalism, but that or
yeah, the
long?
American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States our primary role in foreign policy is to serve as an example for the rest of the world that human beings can govern themselves. That's American exceptionalism properly understood.
And so is that, do you want to expand any more on just nation or have you done so for now?
Well, I would just say that the United States is founded on the premise that justice in this world is impossible. That our government promises to never solve a problem because no problem in the human experience will ever be solved. So what we are here to do is to manage the many rights that many interests that many human beings have and do that peacefully. But if you believe that that justice in this life, in this world is possible, then you are a on the pathway to totalitarianism. And our nation was founded in direct opposition to that idea. Our founders were absolutely clear about this, that we're creating a system that promises to never solve a problem. No problems will ever be solved in America. We are going to balance these rights peacefully and then come back and try again next year.
Wow, lots to unpack in that. Alex, either a response or questions for Professor.
Um, I guess I find myself feeling a little at a loss for words over this exceptionalism issue. Exceptionalism meaning governing yourself, because there are lots of countries in the world that govern themselves with different styles and approaches without being totalitarian. I'm thinking about,
That
say,
human beings,
Japan,
as
for example.
individuals, I'm sorry, maybe I should be more precise, that individuals through can have rights, that individual people as individuals have the
Mm.
right to direct their own lives, not necessarily as members of tribes or groups.
And and when we say that, then are we really suggesting that that is the model for the rest of the world?
We are saying that it's possible.
Yeah,
And it's certainly but the important thing is that it's an example because American exceptionalism is always predicated on, well, I guess the Puritan origin of it, the model of Christian charity. We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. That doesn't mean because it's out of recognition that we can't force other people to do this. The only way that you can actually get human beings to engage in this kind of experiment is for them to first know that it's possible. Second, they have to dedicate themselves to working towards it. They have to see it as a positive good. But these are all things that we can't do for them. That's why it's important to understand it as an aspect of foreign policy, because it's a limitation on what the United States can do for the rest of the
yeah.
world. You can't actually make them want these things. All we can do is serve as an example that it's possible and try to set up the preconditions in the world for the United States to continue to exist, but also make room for the idea that other countries might want to join us in this project. But we can't actually do it for them. We can build a horse trough, we can fill it with water, we can build a trail up to the horse trough, but we, like we sometimes say in teaching, you can't just shove the horse's head underwater and expect and force them to drink. You just end up drowning the horse.
And is it even desirable for every horse to drink from that trough?
Well, not every, I mean, you're getting to questions of free will. Human beings have free will. You have the right to choose your life for yourself. But in order to really have a choice, you have to know that there's an alternative out there.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you can't be said to truly have a choice. So what the United States is really doing is it's providing the world with this like alternative story to know that it's possible. Um, but you can't say you have a choice if somebody's got a gun to your head, and you can't say you have a choice if you don't know that there's an alternative.
Well,
Alex,
I
respond.
think that's a fair degree of humility, really. Um, Sometimes we get so enamored with our way of life, which is wonderful, and we like it, that we think, well, everybody ought to live that way. And what can we do to either force or encourage or stimulate other people to be more like us? And if you visited countries like Japan, which are not at all like the United States, and you ask yourself, well, is this a successful country? You'd have to say, well, yes, it's pretty damn successful. And would I necessarily um, prefer it to the US? Sometimes I would, but a lot of times I wouldn't. Uh, and I, I worry sometimes that we are insufficiently um, appreciative of the cultures that other people have built their nations around and be willing to tolerate the differences.
Professor.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's, you have to constantly be evaluating what is it that I value here. And while I can go somewhere and appreciate many wonderful things about many places, and I enjoy traveling to other places and cultures, but um, and many places are pretty darn close to what I would call, having the best parts about America. Back before the Heritage Foundation kind of went a little bit different the last few years. They used to publish this index of economic freedom, and I used to sometimes show it to my classes and say, "I'm proud to be an American." Where I sing the song, "Where at least I know I'm free, and I'm the 37th freest country on earth now." In other words, we're sort of just because we came up with these ideas doesn't mean that in the year 2024 there aren't other countries out there practicing them and in many ways exceeding our ideals. Um, but um, but on the sort of flip side of that is it doesn't absolve us of our historical responsibility to continue to be the example for the world because of our size and our role that we've played in world history. So we don't get to we don't get to say we don't have to do this anymore simply because New Zealand is doing it better.
Okay, and Alex, a quick retort, or shall I transition slightly?
Well, I suppose I embrace what heritage has evolved
Let's not go
toward.
there yet, because that gets us into a whole different issue.
Well, although let me explain why there's what specifically the connection is. I think that if we're only going to measure ourselves or our exceptionalism on the basis of an index like economic freedom, and it's uh, and without measuring the strength of our culture that actually produced, as you point out yourself, from the Puritan era and John Winthrop, the conditions for that freedom, then I'm worried that we're only measuring the symptoms and not the underlying conditions that cultivate and allow that economic freedom to exist. And so it's a bit like measuring racism on the basis of what outcomes are, as opposed to the way people, uh, uh, what are the underlying values that create racist or non-racist behavior. And I think part of what we can talk about heritage later, but I think heritage has become more concerned with underlying cultural issues that give rise to the fertility of economic freedom as opposed to strictly kind of doctrinaire libertarian economic freedom arguments.
Sure.
Professor.
And that's the sort of always the temptation of social science. We've talked about this many times on the show that, in California, nobody could pass the English or math placement tests. So we just got rid of the tests and said, now everybody's English one ready. Getting rid of the metric doesn't solve the underlying problem. So I would hope that I have a long record of not confusing social science metrics with underlying cultural issues. But that doesn't mean that social science doesn't have a role to play in measuring outcomes at the end of the story. But because ultimately, as I sometimes joke, one of my favorite stories, I don't even know if it's true, but the historian John Gaddis used to go to the American Political Science Association and just wander into panels and say, where's the independent variable? Um, and that in order to demonstrate that when we're talking about human beings out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight has ever been wrought. And these social science metrics will measure outcomes, but they'll never really tell us what to do. If you're in order to know what to do, it involves you've got to talk about the humanities. You need to talk about culture and you need to talk about values.
So we're back united again. Last response to this, Alex?
I certainly agree with everything Steve just has said. I think we got
Okay.
to, the culture is foundational, and if we lose lose track of where we came from, we're not going to be able to continue our previous trajectory.
Excellent. So we have now gone one full half hour with two prominent conservatives, one in academia and one in business. Alex, you have a degree or two.
Yeah, but
Yeah. Go ahead and get. What are they?
BS in engineering and an MBA.
And an MBA. Cool. So you're a business guy. I've got a bachelor's in political science and a law degree. So we have all the suburban higher educated voters taken care of. But I'm not sure we have the high school degree folks throughout America entirely understanding this conversation. So maybe that's just arrogant from my background. But this has been pretty deep so far. So let me go to more crass terms. We have an election coming up in November. And next Tuesday, there's going to be two candidates for the two current dominant political parties. And there's got to be at least one question because they're running for president. There's got to be at least one question on foreign policy because our Constitution puts enormous power in that one individual and a little bit to the US Senate. And sure, Congress can act and the American people can act, but it is a really strong executive in foreign policy. So I assume there'll be a question or two about foreign policy, but maybe not. We're a weird country in weird times, but there will be one. So, not to stump you, but let me see if I can stump you. What you're the interviewer from the TV station. What is your question for those two candidates? Who wants to go first, Professor Tootle or Alex Cranberg?
Boy, I need to cough and exhale to think about this for a second. One question
One
that I
question,
would ask the
and you can
candidates.
follow up.
Um, I guess I would say, boy, it would be one of two things. I'd either ask, so if I wanted to, the softball one that they should be prepared for is what do you think is, rank the global threats to the United States and what would your response be to them? They should
That's
be
a
prepared
softball,
to answer something like that.
right?
But I think a more interesting question to ask them would be what what philosophy underlies your understanding of our relationship with other nations, both from a security standpoint and a trade standpoint? What is it that is guiding, or what do you think the role of the United States should be in the world?
So the first half hour of our conversation would be the more
Yeah.
in-depth. Okay, Alex, what would your question of these two candidates be? And by the way, it's the first time I almost stumped Professor Tootle after 91 podcasts. What's your, see if I can stump you, Alex?
Um, I suppose I'd like uh, Stephen's question. I think it's a very good one. I would just add one more element to it, which is uh, getting back to the cultural one. Are there cultural reasons, why we would support one country and not another that relate to our you know our traditions, um, our historic feelings of loyalty. I think there's a reason why we might feel a little bit more energized to protect uh, Britain versus Brazil.
Interesting. Professor Tootle, what's your response to that? And then Alex, you can ask questions of Professor Tootle.
Well, it's funny because like if I was actually running for president, I don't think I would answer this question maybe so honestly or boldly, but you know, I have a pretty deep skepticism of international institutions when many of the other countries are just engaged in a sort of performative, um, you know, uh, version of international law. And I would much prefer a more robust relationship with nations that have demonstrated that they share our common values. I remember 20 or 30 years ago, gosh, has it been 30 years ago? It's hard to know how old I am anymore. But I remember Andrew Sullivan back in the 90s would sometimes toss around this idea of the Anglosphere, which kind of got in a way it was I wouldn't name it that because but I understand what his purpose was. It was to sort of say which countries on earth have adopted the values of, loosely speaking, the United States and Britain. And many of those countries are not the United States and Britain anymore. But and then you sort of now which ones keep their word? Which ones can you do business with, which is a sort of next tier. And then there are these other countries that they don't keep their word. They share none of our values. I guess you have the Eisenhower Adams for peace attitude of, the olive branch is always here for if you ever change your mind, but we're not expecting Iran to change their mind. Like we need a different regime there. We're not expecting North Korea to come around, and maybe every now and then you remind them that there's an alternative path, but I don't I would never expect China, North Korea, Iran to, you know, keep their word uh, um, in an international relationship of any kind. They might, they might not, but I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't
I
trust them.
suppose with I suppose with respect to any country, including ourselves, I would be much more trusting of aligned self-interest than promises.
Yes.
And we're not exactly very good at keeping our promises on protecting various people. Um, you can give up your nuclear weapons, and we'll protect you, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. It's all about aligned interests. Ultimately, I suggest that there's a natural affinity that creates uh, a, a feeling that we should be allied with somebody. On the other hand, take the Middle East. That obviously in the Middle East, the one place that has that cultural affinity and tradition and cultural alignment is with Israel. But our interests are very much aligned with keeping an alliance with Saudi Arabia, even though you could hardly say that culturally we're particularly close. And ultimately, if foreign policy needs to be about promoting American interests, those people who've thought, well, we should just shut off relations with Saudi Arabia or put pressure on them because they killed Khashoggi, were doing us a disfavor. And now we're having to get realistic and say, oh, yeah, okay, this is kind of really important that we have a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Professor.
Yeah, I guess I just have maybe a slightly different understanding of what interests are, because if we define interests as something as being completely divorced from our ideals, as again Eisenhower in I always felt like the best statement of how to win the Cold War was Eisenhower's policy NSC 162/2, which I'm sure Jake can bring up. But it's an understanding that what makes us strong is our ideals. And that if we compromise our ideals in pursuit of our interests, that we will have won nothing. So um, understand that because we have a representative government at home, and because we hopefully have and would like to nurture a culture of idealism about our founding, that it is in the long-term best interest of the United States to only act in foreign policy when something is in keeping with both our ideals and our interests. And I would say that American foreign policy pre-Woodrow Wilson was pretty much always predicated on that. That American foreign policy pre-Wilson was always, if it's in keeping with our interests but not our ideals, we do nothing. If it's in keeping with our ideals but not our interests, we do nothing. But if it's something is in keeping with both our ideals and our interests, then we act. And that kept us in pretty good shape with regards to the rest of the world until Woodrow Wilson kind of came along and ruined it for everybody.
So, Professor, did your answer end up disagreeing with Alex, but like particularly just for a second on Saudi Arabia, for example? Because to me, it sounds like
Yeah, I just disagree with the definition of what's in our interests. You know, sometimes we something that's narrow within like somebody could come along and say it's in our interests because we need oil. And I would just simply say like, okay, but that's one interest in America, but it's not every interest that America has. Because I'm just for instance, when we were selling oil to Japan and then the rape of Nanking happened, at a certain point, our ideals are have so conflicted with what this country is doing with our oil that we simply say like it's actually no longer in our interest to continue selling oil to Japan because we we don't believe in because what's best for the United States is not a world where Japan gets to do whatever they want in Asia. And we're not going to go to war with them, but we're also not going to supply them with the fuel to slaughter civilians in China.
Well, I think the history of oil sanctions is that there's no such thing as, oh, we're not going to sell you oil because the oil is a pretty, it's a, it's a literally a liquid market.
Yeah,
And we can make ourselves feel good by saying we're not going to sell them oil, but all we're going to do is not buy oil from somebody else that would sell them oil.
yeah.
And
Well, I always say it to my classes this way. It's the reason the word fungible even exists, right? Like not literally, but if you want to understand what fungible means, study oil. Like light sweet crude is light sweet crude. It's a global market.
so. We've gone at almost another 15 minutes, and we haven't gotten to conflict between two significant conservatives. You're both one percenters in your unique ways. And I know there's actually a conflict between you because of past conversations with you both. So let's get to that in just a minute. But I have this question in practical terms. It's one that a similar one to what you said, Professor. When I was in China, they very clearly said, "Do not talk politics." Period. The representatives here in Denver said, "You can't go there and talk politics. Don't." We landed in China, and the embassy came and said, "Do not talk politics. You can talk about whatever you want to. Don't talk politics." So, in private, with a significant diplomat, I wanted to obey those rules because I'm a rule follower. So I simply said to this diplomat, Chinese diplomat, please tell me the entire history of the China US relationship from our founding in 1776 to current. And I just listened instead of talking politics. History. The thing I took from that is this. I'm still shocked at this statement. I want you to correct it or explain it. This diplomat told me you can always trust the United States to act in their own best interest, period. And we can negotiate with that. We can compete against it. We know that you are going to act in your best interest. But Russia, we have no idea what they're doing. They'll violate their own rules, their own laws, their own policies. They'll go against their own economic interests. We have no idea how to negotiate with China. I mean Russia. We can never trust Russia. So I don't know what to think of that. But when we're talking about two of the dominant authoritarian regimes in the world, it's Russia and China. And you already mentioned some others that are significant, North Korea and Iran. But how do we, as voters, listen to whatever these candidates say and try to act in our best interest in security and being a city on the hill, a shining city on the hill? Um, and I'm leading up to a debate between two conservatives. I don't know how you're going to answer this, but tell me as a citizen how we should elect a president and senators and congresspeople to give us safety and security when clearly war drums have been beating and will continue to beat. Take this however you wish. Who wants to go first, Alex or Professor?
I have a simple answer that might be stupid, so maybe I should go first, which is I just think of a president or any politician as a job, and I'm hiring them to keep their oath. So you look at what their oath of office is, and you try to do your best and see which one is more likely to fulfill that oath of office.
Okay, it doesn't help me in foreign policy without more data points, so to speak. But
Well, but I just
was,
mean like as a starting point, that's where I start. Uh,
okay, Alex.
I think my concern is much more about how do we act with enough humility in the world. Um, and we want to, it's a dangerous time. And when we have a dangerous time, uh, we have, there's a tendency um, to villainize anybody that's on the other side. And and as opposed to just looking at people as relatively rational actors that are operating sometimes mistakenly but believe in their country's best interests. And I I would tend to feel that if we get too ideological and less pragmatic, we're more likely to have uh, more conflict. Because as we see in our own country, when people start getting ideological, um, they start getting more combative and hostile.
I guess I'd say like I'm a Hamiltonian, so to me these are two intertwined um, um, entities that can never be disentangled, ideals and interests. They they are always to be balanced, and you can't get rid of one because one is better than the other. You can't get rid of ideals, and you can't get rid of interests because
But
ultimately,
right now, what concerns me is that what we advertise as our ideals are changing. And our ideals that we present in the rest of the world are increasingly, um, well, I hate to use the phrase woke, but I will. We used to just be about, um, we used just to be about freedom. And the agenda has broadened so much to include various social justice, human rights. I say not really human rights, but what are now the broadened agenda of human rights. Um, that I've become a lot more concerned about our trying to operate on the international stage on the basis of what some people feel who happen to be in power today are our ideals, which I don't share. And so I see us, for example, in a place like Hungary, uh, trying to impose a LGBTQ point of view on another country that uh, that has maybe certainly a relationship to the ideals that those in power currently have, but don't really share much with the historic tradition of what American ideals are. And I worry that in getting to be increasingly, we're we're not solving our own problem at home about what we stand for, because we are conflicted about what we stand for. So how can we try to present this very strong muscular approach in the rest of the world for a divided view of what our ideals are? And this is a time, therefore, to have much more humility about international projection, when we better mind our own home here about what do we stand for, develop our own consensus, and okay, come out to the rest of the world again a little bit more strongly. But particularly if our model is the city on a hill, I mean, um, uh, the Puritans didn't go out and raid South Carolina. They were this. They presented themselves as an example. I don't think they probably even sent foreign aid to some Puritan expeditionary force in South Carolina.
No, no, no. You get no. Actually, I don't disagree with any of this. But I would just say that I don't need, and where I sort of, if you want to get to the point of disagreement, it's really where we get to the point where there are some people who would take what Mr. Cranberg has said and say, therefore, we need the American founding is and has always been flawed, and we need to disregard the United States of America in favor of something better, our own nationalistic theocracy. And I simply would say, I'm all for everything that Alex has said. I agree that what we need is to rediscover Eisenhower, the person who was constantly saying that and balancing the values of the United States with making sure that we're projecting the right image abroad. No more, no less. Or to, as Theodore Roosevelt said, I care for the man who takes the next step, not the one who theorizes about the 1000th step, right? That what we do in foreign policy is we don't say, you're evil if you're not exactly where California's voter ID law is right now. you know,
Well,
instead,
the irony is we're saying to, for example, in Hungary, that you're evil because you're trying to politically select judges, and yet here we are in the United States, and that's what we do.
yeah, no, you'll get no, like I said, no argument from me about this.
So I don't think conservatives are sometimes accused, especially if you want to call them MAGA conservatives, are accused of being nationalistic, theocratic types. I don't think that's a fair description. I think a fairer description is that these are conservatives that are aware that John Winthrop and Puritanism is at the foundation of American exceptionalism.
Well, I would hope so, except for
They not be explicitly aware, but they understand that there is a um, an, Anglo-Protestant basis that we should be respecting, we should be learning about, we should be understanding. We shouldn't be, we shouldn't be sectarian, but we should be respectful and knowledgeable and appreciative of why we are where we are, and that involves um, teaching, learning about our our faith backgrounds.
sure, except here, and this is where I just would draw the line, which is that, the original mission of the Claremont Institute was to apply the lessons of the founding to contemporary political problems. And I thought, oh, I found a home. This is a perfect place for me. And then they started hiring people who would say, um, I believe in natural law so much that I believe that we should destroy the government of the United States and establish a Catholic theocracy, and on the basis of more natural law than what our founders put into our founding. And I said, well, then I'm out.
I
Because
don't think that's mainstream Claremont, but that's a that's a I an individual minority voice, I would argue, but
yeah,
getting
no,
into
and I still have
inside
friends there from
baseball
the old
card stuff
days,
here.
but they they they're the people who give them money like those essays. uh,
Gentlemen, forgive me. I've been involved in Republican politics for 32 years before becoming an independent. And I do this a lot. I'm not a follower of Claremont. I've heard of it, but I don't subscribe. I don't get their stuff. And so, for the average viewer of this in the coming weeks and months, we lost them. So, who cares about Claremont? I think you're
Well,
talking
how
about
about
Christian
Tucker
nationalism.
Carlson? There's a good example from yesterday because Tucker Carlson had a Churchill hating, you know, pro-Nazi guy on his show, and Neil Ferguson, who's from the Hoover Institute, and Victor Davis Hanson, and Sorba Mari, of all people, all wrote articles published in the Free Press of all places, um, condemning everything that had been said on the show. And Victor Davis Hanson went point by point, refuting um, every single thing in that article. And I don't think I'm revealing too much to say, I'm a former Victor Davis Hanson student. I emailed him and he wrote me back and I said, great article, good job, because it's an important thing that someone with your credibility reminds people that there are lines and that you can't cross.
Well, so
And
Professor, we can read this article, but you've still lost me because most people don't watch these shows or listen to these blogs. To not dumb it down, but translate it for the person who doesn't pay attention to politics, and then Alex get a response to this.
okay, just for instance, we should be careful if we say there's an Anglo-American tradition to say, yes, that's the origin of these ideals, but these ideals are actually for everyone. They, they work for everybody. That the United States of America is an ideological nation state. And Peter Schramm's old essay, I was born American, but in the wrong place. He's Hungarian. And he immigrated to the United States because his dad told him, when he asked, why do we have to go to America? He said, because we're born American, just in the wrong place. Meaning that it doesn't matter what color your skin is, it doesn't matter where you were born. It is important to learn where these ideals came from. And I would never disagree with Alex on that. But I would just always want to emphasize that anybody who wants to join in this ideological nation state we call America, you can be born American and in the wrong place, and then come here and
And
be an American.
I don't think that I've said anything that is contrary to that
No,
at
no,
all.
I would just mean as a point of emphasis, because John was asking about how a normal person might hear this. I
The
can
thing
tell you
I
that,
worry about is that people who are not born American come over here and um, and I mean born American the way that you just said it. They
yeah,
are
yeah.
born American philosophically or in their preferences and in their ideals and values. Um, we're not born American, and they come over here because they want to get free stuff, or they don't like wherever it was, what the shithole country they came from.
Yeah. So what I would just, where I happen to live and teach, I can just tell you that when you say the word Anglo, the ears perk up in the faculty lounge,
This
so
is exactly the problem because if people feel that way, it's a symptom of something.
right.
It's a symptom
But
of a disease.
yeah, but as a teacher, what I always try to do is say, no, no, no. I understand that when you hear it, you hear this thing. Now let me explain what we mean by
Yeah,
this.
sure.
You know,
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, I need to interrupt again, although this is a great port of conversations. Forgive me. We might be up against a timeline. I'm not sure. Hard times. Alex, how's your time? Can we go 10 or 15 minutes longer, or you have
Yeah,
a,
sure.
yeah,
how are you, Professor?
I'm fine. I just have to, I'm getting my car serviced today in
Yeah,
Fresno.
but
So
you can go another 15.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I do want to open it up for a few minutes of questions and answers if anybody has it here. There's a couple folks on the line, so to speak. But before we do that, this is your closing statement on foreign policy. John, why did we not talk about, I don't know, the Ukraine? Why did we not talk about Latin America or China's economic policy? Or I mean, these are really important issues. Glad we're talking about it, but we've missed the whole point. John, we should have talked about blank. This is your time to talk about blank before we see if there's any questions. Alex or Stephen, who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first because I can explain why. Because I think first principles are important, that you have to understand what you actually believe in and then accept the conditions of the world as they are. And thus, we could talk about specific countries in the year 2024, but I think it's much more important to understand the Hamiltonian tradition or the Eisenhower tradition, whatever you're more comfortable with, of balancing ideals and interests, and that what Eisenhower was trying to do was restore the United States to what it had been pre Woodrow Wilson, um, and account for the fact that we live in a modern world now, because but because of that, I would just simply defend the not talking about the specifics because I think it's far more important for Americans to understand what they stand for first. Get your own ideals worked out, and then confront the world.
Alex, and then I've got a response for probably both of you. Alex, what should we have talked about, or what did you want to talk about?
I would just like to emphasize a point I made earlier because I don't think people appreciate the extent to which um, our government is representing interests abroad and pushing ideals and agendas abroad that we don't fully accept here in the United States. That's one, and I've seen that firsthand
But you've seen that
where I do business.
you've seen that internally within the United States,
Well, I'm
and
saying the confrontation over something like LGBTQ um, is something that we're still trying to resolve here in the United States. I mean, how far do you go? We've accepted some things, not others. Gender uh, fluidity, very controversial in the United States, and yet we're taking foreign policy positions on that abroad. Um, so I think that's one area that we're having our internal debates being broadcast out on the international stage, and it's pissing a bunch of people off. It's creating enemies that we don't need to be creating. Um, we need to be much more restricted in terms of what we think are core U.S. values, and not play a much broader social justice agenda in a bunch of other countries that end up setting countries against us and harming not just our material interests, but also our value interests. It's why I see a country like Hungary gravitating toward Russia is because, which they shouldn't, but it's because they're being forced into uh, a mold that we're part of the problem of not letting Hungary be Hungary.
Yeah,
And so they go in some other direction that actually is worse.
I think in some ways what Alex is talking about is almost a parallel for what it's because what I'm hearing from Alex is very similar to what I'm trying to communicate about academics, which is when I'm talking to somebody in the outside world, I'm trying to tell them, look, no matter what you're imagining, it's so much worse than what you're imagining.
Yeah.
That I understand this is not your world, and you think you know. Oh, okay, the United States is pushing this agenda. Or in my case, oh, you think you know, right? There are some liberals in higher education. And I'm sitting here telling you, no, no, no. It's so much worse than that. The liberals have all been fired. Like you're finally identifying the problem of the 1980s. Uh, we are so far beyond uh, and I guess that's kind of my big takeaway from Alex is that he's communicating from the business world what I'm trying to communicate from the academic world
Agreed.
is, hey,
Uh,
outside world, you have no idea how bad this actually is.
So I brought two significant conservatives together in agreement. Thank you. I've done my job. Now let me tear you apart again, and we got to do this quickly and closely. If my memory's right, the United States is about a quarter of the world's GDP. European Union is about a quarter of the world's GDP. So half the world's wealth is centered in NATO. And I just firmly believe that we've got to take principles and policy together. And we have allies and treaties. We have a commitment since World War II that we have got to protect NATO. And our NATO friends, our European friends, want to protect Ukraine. Now, we don't need to get into all the details of Ukraine, but I think it's an easy, no brainer answer that we need a strong NATO. Apparently, conservatives are completely divided over this, and it just shocks me to the core. I'm confused by it. A quick response from both of you, then we're going to open it up to Q&A.
I guess the question is, what is it that defines strength for NATO? Conservatives want a strong NATO, and there's a debate as to how to strengthen NATO. Do you strengthen NATO by having the U.S. be the dominant, partner, or do you require countries to contribute more substantially to NATO as Trump has insisted and threatened over? Threatened, okay, we're going to leave if you don't do your part, kind of thing. And so that's strengthening NATO, or is it weakening NATO? Conservatives have a different point of view about that. I think it strengthens NATO. And there's the question about how far does the perimeter of NATO extend? Should Georgia be in NATO? Are we really willing to go to war over Georgia? And what does Georgia present? And I'm talking about, of course, not
Right.
the state, which I'm perfectly willing to defend. But
Thank you. Thank you, Pat.
And then balanced against the question is, what does Georgia bring to NATO? There's some strategic elements it brings to it, but I think it's a cold calculus, and conservatives of one stripe want to see it expanded as much as possible, primarily for ideological reasons, because it's a security envelope, which then protects a broader array of something, which hopefully is good, but sometimes isn't so good. And that's the earlier concern that I had, that maybe what we're protecting it and what we think it is. But if it's any security perimeter that extends too far becomes weaker.
Professor.
Without
Yeah,
commenting on any specific expansion, I think that's the legitimate concern.
yeah. I mean, that's reminds me of one of my favorite old lectures to give was on the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was the Great International Kiss, which was a pact we signed precisely so that it would never be enforced. We got everyone to sign it, knowing that the more signatories there are to an agreement, the less binding it becomes. And people always teach that as a failure of American foreign policy, but no, it was not a failure. It was a great success. The whole point of it was to have us get out of a mutual defense treaty with the French. So that was not a failure. We did that on purpose and under exactly the principle that Alex was describing. And so, Frank Kellogg wasn't dumb. In fact, in his diary that night, he wrote, "The trick has been turned." Maybe, like he knew what he was doing when we signed it. But it's time to probably bring up the third stool of American or Hamiltonian Eisenhower Coolidge Theodore Roosevelt foreign policy, maybe Bush two foreign policy, which is we already talked about American exceptionalism, and we already talked about balancing ideals and interests. So it's time to talk about the third stool, the third leg, which is unilateralism, which is in all of our relationships, we always preserve the ability to act alone if we need to. And I think that I'm all for a rediscovery of the Hamilton Eisenhower foreign policy tradition. I would love it if there was some presidential candidate who was saying that what we needed to have was a foreign policy based on American exceptionalism, properly understood, unilateralism, and a balancing of ideals and interests. I think that would be fantastic.
I would say you're describing a Trump foreign policy.
It's
Oh,
just
bridge too far,
oh,
Alan.
well,
Oh,
I
and the
would love
reason
to
I
hear him
say the
say
reason I
that.
say that is I
If,
think it's a question about this balance um, is a big thing. Unilateralism. Well, Trump is perfectly willing to be unilateral. He's not going to hang around for all the allies to sign on to something. I think part of his strength is, and part of the reason that some of our enemies are nervous about him is that he's willing to say, okay, we're going to go do X. I mean, he's not going to put up with. Um, I think he's just more willing to act unilaterally. Now that could be, that could also be dangerous, but he is not. He's focused first and foremost on what it takes to get something done for the U.S. interest, even if it's not in the interest of our allies.
I would just simply say there's a big difference between somebody who sometimes acts alone as part of a chaotic foreign policy rather than um, reserves the right to act unilaterally as part of a coherent and steady foreign policy. A broken clock uh, telling time once a day it does not mean that a coherent policy is underlying this because unilateralism is more than I don't simply mean someone who does whatever they want. I,
No, but it's something. It's leadership is what
yeah,
you're really talking about. And so for
sure.
what I saw was leadership within in the Middle East, where we're he had to buck European point of view about Iran. We're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem.
I think that's the
we're
best
going to
example. Yeah.
we're going to create a peace accords with Saudi Arabia. And there were a bunch of people in the State Department that thought, oh, that's not great. Europe didn't want them to do that. Said, no, this is where we're going to go.
I would just prefer Reagan then. I would. I don't disagree with any of those things, and I do think that it does take a president of a certain amount of character and gumption to buck the State Department and the existing. I'm no fan of that world, but I would just prefer that it is done out of a strength of leadership that is part of a coherent view of the world, um, rather than something that certainly seems arbitrary and chaotic.
So we've covered a lot of ground and we're missing a lot of territory too as well. So I apologize for that. I do want to do a quick Q&A, and I know we're leaving in 3 or 4 minutes. So Kim, did you still have a question, or has it been covered in the rest of the conversation?
Oh, well, first, I just want to say thank you for letting me listen. My blood pressure is elevated because I've never sat in silence so long in my life. I don't think when politics was being discussed, I would pay money to have a beer with all of you. I was born a Reagan Republican in California in 1969, and I think we agree, but we certainly disagree on a lot of things. And I appreciate the conversation. If conservatives around the country spoke as you all have, I'd feel better about trying to be a Republican sometimes, because right now it's just so sideways for me. And I think that there's a lot still to be talked about. And I don't think it's just our enemies who are nervous about Trump. I just came back from time in Germany. I'm fluent in German and have lots of conservative political friends in Germany who served in high office. And there's a lot of people in Europe who are nervous about this country and our leadership from both directions. So thanks for the conversation.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
Bill, I think you're traveling. Jake or I think that's it. Bill or Jake, any comments or questions, or should we let them have a concluding statement? I don't see it. So forgive me for not getting to a couple things I wanted to get to, ladies and gentlemen. So, Professor Tootle, you have 1 minute to just summarize what we should be thinking about as citizens when we watch this debate and vote in November.
Well, we all have to. I'm pretty good friends with Steve Hayward, and he had a statement for how he's managed to get through the last 8 years. And he said, "Some of my friends do this, and some of my friends do that, and I'm sticking with my friends." I think that we've drawn different circles, and we have different points of I will go this far, but no further. And some of the circles I felt like I had to draw or while Trump was in office. I don't really have a lot of regrets in that in that space. It's probably cost me some, I don't know, whatever historians do that gets them ahead in the world. But I can still sleep at night, and I think that as long as you're uh, taking a candid look at your information and doing your best, we should have considerable grace for anyone we're talking about politics with, because we're all just trying to get by, doing the best we can, I hope. Um, and uh, with regard to Alex, I would just simply say, if we were to draw a line around our friend group, your 98 of them would probably be the same. And there are probably two of those guys where I would just say, like, I don't want to be with them at a cocktail party. And I don't know if that's enough to make somebody a mortal enemy, um, when really where I have always drawn the line is an American patriot. I I love the values of the United States of America as an ideological nation state, as it was conceived of by the founders. And I'm perfectly willing to talk to people who aren't, but I will never forsake that core belief while following any ideological path. So when there were people who simply became, to me, unpatriotic, in other words, started making the argument, I love America so much that I want to see it destroyed, I simply would say, like, I'm out of here. That's where I draw the line. Um, and that's really the only, I would say, point of disagreement with me and some of the people on the, let's call it MAGA fringes.
Okay, Alex, you. I know we have to leave in 2 minutes. We're already 15 minutes
Mhm.
over. You have 2 minutes to say whatever you wish to say on any topic. Your message to American citizens.
Uh, Obviously, Steve and I largely align. I'm more willing to call myself MAGA, um, even though that's considered an epithet in some places, because I have a different understanding of what that actually means than some others do. I don't really know anybody that thinks that America is so great that it must be destroyed. I'm not even sure what that means. People have different ideas from right to left as to what it is that strengthens or harms America. But I would just uh, reinforce something that Stephen said, which is that America stands for something, that it is it does have a defined, or it used to, hopefully still does, a defined set of ideals. And that's the heart of what a nation is all about, is that it does have some cohesiveness, that there's an assimilation into something, because not everybody that comes here necessarily always has the exact same ideals, but they assimilate into a common set of beliefs and ideals. And I think the biggest concern that there is around the world, not just in the United States, but around the world, because you see this in Germany and you see it in Hungary, it's throughout the EU, it's a question, an issue. Japan deals with immigration in its own way, which is, hey, we don't want any of it because we want to keep our culture the way it is. And Stephen's saying, hey, I'd like to keep American culture the way it is. Why we are not defining culture the same way here in the United States as they do in Japan. But I'm an American patriot. What does that mean? That doesn't mean just a random bunch of folks hanging around.
Right.
It means something. And I think whether we're thinking about the United States or our relationships with the world, that there's ultimately, and this is where my view of conservative nationalism comes in, we need to support, respect, and appreciate what makes each nation unique and reinforce that. And in the case of the United States, that means reinforcing those very ideals that make you want to defend America. That you would say, hey, I know why my children or my neighbor's children will go to war for this country. And it's not for some kind of bland, homogenized, you know, Euro trash ideal. It's
That's
Yeah.
competition.
No, it's
it's
great. I
for the
mean, I
uniqueness.
agree
I
with
mean,
every,
people,
every
Hungarian kids are going to go to Hungarian army, not because of what they grew up with, a culture, tradition. Hungary means something. I was shocked to learn that Germany, why is AFD now suddenly, which is supposedly this far right organization, won an election in Eastern Germany in a couple of provinces? I was shocked to find out that 26% of Germans are foreign born. Now
Yep.
that's amazing. 26%. The United States, even though we consider ourselves a country of immigration, the United States has never, until maybe this year, had more than 15% foreign born in our country.
That is true.
And I would argue that above some threshold, I don't know what it is, but and it's going to vary in time and it's going to vary in place, that a country cannot assimilate and create an identity that people will send their children to die for above a certain percentage. And if you look at history, tendency for the United States, that number has been around 15% before kind of all hell breaks loose, like it is now. I'm a big pro-immigration person. I've testified in favor of immigration for and subsidized tuition for certain types of immigrant, and I've sponsored immigrants from Vietnam. I'm very pro-immigration, but I'm also like Steve. I feel like the U.S. needs to stand for something that we are willing to die for, and that means I think probably we need to be concerned about who's coming in. Are they really willing to be part of what America has stood for historically and continue to be for, and then be understanding of other countries that find themselves in the same position, or maybe even worse in terms of percentage that did not grow up in the traditions of the country that they came from, that
Alex,
they're living in. So that's
thank
where
yeah,
because it connects the domestic and the foreign policy issues.
yeah.
Alex, very
Oh,
much appreciate your time.
sorry.
Stephen, this is you're the star of the show. You get a
Oh,
15 to 20-second conclusion.
I disagree with everything Alex said. There's so many great examples of this. This is what's the whole point of Peter Schramm's life. He even hosted this thing called You Americans, where he was saying like, why do I have to teach you what American values are? I'm an immigrant from Hungary, and why is it that Americans don't understand their own history, and somehow I have to be the one to teach it to them? And I just yeah, sorry, Alex. Lincoln agrees with you too, that
So, Stevie, you're turning into an AtCon.
no, but here's the problem. Here's where I again get off is that I've always been a nationalist as long as we define that. And this is the first debate I ever had with Rich Lowry, because he was writing a book on nationalism. But I wanted to say, and I said to him at the time, you need to understand what it means that America is an ideological nation state. And as long as we're defining nationalism, and as long as we're defining patriotism as a commitment to that set of ideals, well, then yes, I am a nationalist, but only in the sense that I am a patriot, because I'm not a nationalist in the sense of my country right or wrong. I'm my country as long as it keeps. I am committed to the ideals of the United States of America, not the borders, the land, the blood, or the soil. It's the ideals of America that I'm committed to. So I am an ideological, I am
So
committed
would
to the
you
United
send
States of
your
America.
son to serve in an army of another country somewhere else that shared the U.S. ideals?
Yeah, and I knew, and there are examples of people who, joined the Canadian Army to go and fight Nazis first earlier. I had a great uncle who joined the Chinese Air Force, go and fight Japan, and as part of, so I would be fine with that. I mean, again, under certain circumstances.
All
If
right, gentlemen, you'll just have to blame the facilitator to leave it with
Okay.
a big kind of question mark of
Yeah,
where
yes.
we actually stand on these big issues. Thank you for your time today. We'll probably have a third if you're so inclined, Alex. Otherwise, Professor Tootle and I do this most Fridays.
Yeah, we got, the other person, sorry, we got to get Tony Williams from the Bill of Rights Institute in this, because having him or Stephen Knott in this discussion would be even better, because they're better about talking about some of these issues than I am.
And
They're
Alex, you can bring an ally as well. So thank you both for your time. You represented your views eloquently today. Thank you. Having a great day, y'all.
great to see
Thank
you
you.
guys.